Okay, so for this week, we are going to talk about the history of social work using chapter 2 from the Segal et al. Text to look at the history of how we started and where we are. So the textbook does a really nice job of outlining the major periods of history and kind of the laws, the cultural issues that were happening at that time, policies, perceptions of the community, and how that has affected our field over the last several hundred years. And so each one of these has things that have implications for us today. And so what you find as social workers, we often study the history of our field. It's valuable to know where we are now and where we are moving forward, but it's also really important to understand how we got here. And so I won't go through each one of these. The book does a really nice job, but there's a couple things I want you to be aware of. Each one of these periods of histories had significant challenges in some way when it came to understanding how do we deal with people with mental health? How do we deal with addressing poverty? What does that look like? And so each kind of era or decade has tried to address it in some way, whether that's through communities coming together to address the issues, whether it's through laws, whether it's the idea of the state should do it or the federal government should do it. Each has had kind of its own approach. It's really important, though, to understand that even at the very beginning of our country, even back in the colonial period, we had this kind of idea. There were the Elizabethan Poor Laws that were enacted in Britain in the early 1600s. And what they were really trying to figure out is who is poor? How do we define that? And who is worthy of assistance and who determines that, right? And that's still something we struggle with a little bit today. Whose kind of responsibility is it to take care of people who are struggling? Is it the state government? Is it the federal government? Is it the community? Is it a faith-based community? Who is responsible? And so even back hundreds and hundreds of years ago, it really started the debate of, are people worthy or unworthy of assistance? Who determines that and who takes care of individuals? And so throughout history, we've always had this kind of debate, so to speak, about whose responsibility is it? Who takes care of people who are struggling, who are injured, who are disabled? What does that even look like? Even later, so looking through the decades to like the retrenchment years from 1976 to 2000, there was the idea of the social policies of family values. Who should be responsible for social care? Is it the family's job? Is it their responsibility to take care of themselves? Is it the extended family's job? Or is it something like we need external supports for families who are working but struggling financially still? In the 1980s and 1990s, the family still was viewed as responsible for that. And we made policies about things like welfare and TAMF based on this idea that people are worthy or unworthy. Those who are working hard enough or job searching hard enough, they deserve it. But those who don't, those are just welfare moms, right? And so even if you look from the colonial period all the way down to almost the 2000s, we still are having this internal debate about who is, quote, worthy of resources and who administers them, who is responsible for them. So it's been a continuous theme, regardless of the changes of policies over the last several hundred years. We definitely see some of those tensions and themes. So why study history? Some of you are going to love this section. Some of you are going to be bored out of your mind, and that's okay. There's two reasons that we study it. First, we have to know where we came from. It helps us as social workers to understand what is the roots of our profession, what is the roots of our country, and how we view individualism versus collectivism. The other thing is the tensions today. Like I mentioned, that example of all the way back to the early 1600s, deciding who was worthy of help. We've still had that debate even today. Who is worried? Do we do needs-based? Do we do income-based? Do we just give people resources based on, if they say, hey, I need this, do we give that to them? Some would say yes, absolutely. It doesn't matter if people are, quote, worthy or not. If they're asking for help financially or food-wise, we should do it. Others are like, nope, we've got limited resources. We don't want to give it out to everyone. So we still have this debate. So some of the tensions that we still see either from early in our history and still struggle with today are who takes care of those who are struggling, who benefits from it, and who pays for it. Which factors are responsible for poverty? There's always been a big debate. Is it an individual choice? Is it individual failing? Is it something that's a larger societal issue? So which factors are responsible for poverty? Is it the individual? Is it the environment, the community, or is it both? There's been the debate about nature versus nurture. So is it, that individuals are inherently born with a certain set of skills, or do they have to be nurtured? Is it something like people are just born into poverty and that's how they are and that's how it remains? Or do people sink into poverty because of life changes that happen to them? For example, I had a student years ago who said that she was a middle class family, and then her dad died very unexpectedly, and they fell really deep into poverty. Her mom had not worked. She had been a stay-at-home mom. She had 4 siblings. And she said they went from middle class, traveling, nice vacations, Disneyland, to literally living in poverty and worrying about living in their car. And so it's trying to figure out, is that a nature thing? Was that a poor choice on her mom's part? Or was that kind of the result of this series of dominoes that fell in their lives? Again, we're also looking at how do we actually help people? Do we give them resources? Do we give them money? Do we give them housing? Do we give them skill building, like trainings, like Department of Labor? What actually is going to help people, and what level do we do it at? Federal, state, county, and community. And we're always in that debate about, do we empower people? Do we say, like, you can do this, I believe in you, let's work on the skills you need to advocate for yourself and to move forward in your life? Or do we have to have some level of chastisement, right? That might say something like, hey, look, you made a bad choice. You were in recovery. You have been for a while. You knew that if you were going to relapse, you might potentially not get your children back. Do we not say that? Do we empower parents? What is that role? And a lot of our systems, unfortunately, are very punitive and work on a chastisement model. Things like our legal system, our justice system, child welfare systems can be very punitive or kind of have that chastising moment versus empowerment. And it's a tough one because empowerment is important for sure. But I also have had clients that said, hey, sometimes it was the hard truth. And someone looking at me saying, you can do better than this, man. I believe in you. You can't keep going down this road, that motivated them the most. So it's always a back and forth debate. So that's why we have to understand the history of our field, because so many of these tensions, so many of these debates are things that started 100, 150, 200 years ago, and we're still wrestling with them today. One thing that your book is going to talk about, and we talk a lot about in this field, is this idea that we had two movements that kind of started our field of social work. One was the charity organization societies. And so with these ones, they had kind of one approach to things. It started as the idea of friendly visitors, who were women, often middle class or upper class, who lived outside of a community. They would go into like the tenements of New York. They would try to like mentor and connect with individuals. They would give them pamphlets about, good parenting and the dangers of drinking and that kind of thing. And so they really focused on the causes. They felt like they were looking at the causes of poverty and eliminating them. So they said the cause of poverty is drinking. Well, we're going to go out, we're going to chastise individuals and say you shouldn't be drinking or making bad choices. You just need to fill in the blank and your life will get better. It was really a focus on the individual who needed rehabilitation. It was less about the society or the community and more emphasizing the individual's choices, the individual's desire to change, grow, and improve. And they viewed poverty really as a character defect, that it was just because you were lazy and you made bad choices, right? You just drank because you didn't make good choices, right? Not really understanding the complexities of, immigrants who were here, who were struggling with the language. The tenements were terrible living conditions. The oppression, right? The prejudice and racism that we had against people who were coming to our country. There were a lot of different things, but they viewed poverty as kind of this character defect. And so it was this idea of, we look at poverty, we eliminate it through the use of these friendly visitors. Now, kind of at the same time, parallel, we have the settlement movement, which really looked at individuals' well-being and how it was linked to the environment. So Jane Addams is one of the mothers of social work. And she really started to look at the fact that, like, hey, we don't have schools for kids. Our communities are a mess. People are working these long hours. We still have child labor. And so she was really trying to say, like, look, if we want to help individuals improve their well-being, we got to fix the environment. We got to provide education, safe housing, an area where people can be safe. And so she started the settlement movement. There were settlement houses. They were almost like a community center offering resources. And a lot of times the idea was that workers would live in their own community. So you would have someone who was working, they would be in that neighborhood, and wouldn't be someone who lived in a different part of town coming in. They would live in the community that they work. The idea was they would shrink the gap between the rich and the poor. And then instead of changing the individual, we focused on changing the environment. And so I've seen this idea of community today. Some social workers, because of the overlap and issues with things like dual relationships, they don't want to live in the community that they work. It's really hard to work a job like child welfare, right, in the community that you live. What if you get a call on someone that goes to your faith-based community, or someone that's, your best friend's son or something like that? It can be hard. So some prefer to live outside the community, but some workers want to live where they practice. And so we even have that debate about what's more effective, to live in the community and serve it, or does that put you at risk for things like ethical violations or boundary issues? Do you live outside your community and then serve? So it's always back and forth. And so I think it's easy to kind of get frustrated with one and say, oh, it's clearly the settlement movement. But I think there's been this kind of movement back and forth, and we realize that environment is critical, but sometimes people also struggle with things like internal motivation, internal desire, internal skills. So there is a need for individuals. The other thing is the charity organization societies are really credited with the building of case management. They would keep detailed records about who they worked with, who they saw, what they talked about. And that really is kind of the start of our documentation, to track clients, to understand, home visits, that idea of engaging with people in their house and keeping track of all of that really is kind of the beginning of our documentation and case management system. So both of these had pros and cons for sure, and still impact modern social work today. So some things to think about when we're looking, is just those continual values tension, right? Thinking about you or what you've seen in your job, do you change the person or the system? Do you view people as worthy or unworthy when deciding things like resource distribution? There's this idea of religious values or separation of church and state. One thing we find is in states, especially like Idaho, where we don't have a very strong political system that supports social services, it's not an all or nothing thing. We've had some governors and some legislators and people that are very supportive, but in general, there kind of is this idea of communities need to care for themselves, and the government shouldn't have as much of a involvement or a hand in it. And so there's that idea of we need to keep separation of church and state that people want, but at the same time, like in Idaho, a lot of the social service agencies are through faith-based communities that have stepped up and said, there's a hole, we need to fill it. And so they've developed an organization. And so that can always be challenging too, to figure out, how do we serve people? Do we serve people who are not religious at religious agencies? What does that look like? And what you find is most of them here, they don't expect you to have any one belief, right? The idea is we help, maybe the funding is through a religious organization, but we still believe that all are worthy of help. But there's been some stuff in the news. Some organizations will require, that you have to have a belief system, or you have to attend a church service. And so it creates a lot of tension. It also helps us understand there's some of that tension between, are we the impartial professional? Do we come in? Do we give our pamphlet? Do we help a little bit and then we're out? Or do we advocate? Do we work? Do we partner with and walk alongside our clients, which also can be problematic as well occasionally, depending on boundaries and ethics. So other couple values tensions that we see as a result of our history is, do we help people we know, or do we help strangers? Do we help our own community, or do we help people outside of it? Do we serve in crisis, or do people in ongoing need? Do we use our resources? Do we allocate our time and resources to people only in crisis, but then miss the need for funding? Right? Let's say one of the big debates is, do you help people who are struggling with active substance use, or do you put a lot of money into things like preventative and prevention programs, and like those who are doing like medication assisted treatment? Do we put money into that so they can get, curriculum and peer support and things like that? Or do we only focus on crisis, right? Do we fund emergency departments, or do we fund long-term residential? And so we're still always debating, do we deal with the crisis or do we deal with ongoing need? And again, that also speaks, are we spending our money and our time on things like prevention programs or intervention? Because both are necessary, and we often are limited funding wise in how we handle things. So we're always debating, do we respond proactively or do we respond reactively? Do we focus on things that haven't happened yet but could, like prevention, or do we happen on things where people are struggling, like people are struggling with substance use? So always a back and forth. So we quickly have to think about the future of social work. So I want you to take a few moments just to reflect on the following questions as we end. One, what major issue or challenge will social workers need to address in the next 5 years? What do you think is going to be a big issue? Do you think it'll be a local or a national issue? And I would love for you to think, what is the values tension when you think, whether it's bullying or social media or transgender rights, whatever that may be, what is the values tension that becomes the issue there? Is it something like there's confusion about, do we change the person or the system? Do we act as impartial professional or advocate? Do we deal with crisis or an ongoing need? What is the values tension that relates to that, and why is that such a challenge? So moving forward, I just want you to know, complete your online activities, keep going, make sure that you have followed up on your service learning project, reflect on your own community. When we meet for week 4, we will talk about poverty and what that looks like. And I want you to think about what are the areas that could be improved to support those who are struggling. And like I said, we will look at poverty next. Here's the references. Thanks so much.